neighbor, welcome to another episode of Fermentation Friday. Now, we have been talking about this for a while, getting some sourdough done. Recently, about 25 of you all tagged me into someone who was doing sourdough to see if I could help in the process as well. And definitely I am going to, but there are some things that we have to discuss first, okay? So come on, get close so we can have this conversation. Okay, first and foremost, why do you want to make this sourdough? Because you got to have a good reason, because it's like raising a baby, okay? It's like having a pet. You're not just going to be able to do this and walk away and forget it, because she doesn't play that, okay? So why do you want to make the sourdough, all right? Are you willing, are you able to commit the time and effort that it takes to raise a healthy sourdough? Okay. If you are, we're going to do this, okay? Now, I'd like to preface this with, this is the method that I have found that has worked for me. If you've ever done any research into your sourdough, you know there are thousands and thousands of different recipes of different ways to start your starter. It's a whole bunch of different stuff out here, okay? So I'm going to share with you what I have done, what has worked for me, and hopefully it will work for you as well, okay? Okay, so we're going to start just with what sourdough is. Sourdough is the fermentation of your flour that acts as a natural leavening agent to your bread. So basically, sourdough is natural yeast that is going to give you the lift and the rise that you want on your bread. That's why we're doing it on fermentation, because that's all you're doing is you're fermenting the wheat. Now, we're going to start small. I know there's recipes that call for grams and cups and that type of thing. I have found that that makes it more unmanageable if you go into bigger amounts, because you're feeding this every day, which means you're going to be growing it, so you have to have the space for it. A straight-sided jar without a bunch of nooks and crannies so you don't get dry flour stuck in the corners and that type of thing is like best. I also like the jars instead of the larger containers, because you can actually see how much rise you're going to get in your beginning sourdough, because it's going to go up along the walls, where the wider containers, they tend to end up leaving your sourdough flat, so it's hard to kind of gauge how much rise you've gotten if you haven't marked it, that type of thing. So straight-sided jar. I use quart jars. I also use 2-quart jars, because when we get to the point where we are discarding, I like to go into a clean jar so that I can, again, keep up with the growth, be able to see my bubbles and that type of thing. But you can work from the same jar for your discard. You just got to make sure that you keep your jar clean so that you can monitor the activity going on in your sourdough, okay? So it's a 7-day process, okay? On day 1, we're going to start with a tablespoon of warm water, about 80 degrees, okay? Tablespoon of warm water. We're going to do a tablespoon of whole wheat flour and a tablespoon of all-purpose flour that's going into our jar, okay? You're going to mix that till you don't see any dry flour. You're going to loosely lid it, okay? So you can put the lid on and put the ring on, but we're not going to do it tight. Day 1. Day 2, you're going to repeat the same process. Now, why we don't have any discard is because we're using the smaller amounts. We're using the smaller amounts, so you don't have to double your feeding because you're taking away from it. We're just adding to the jar, thus the tablespoon. You're going to repeat that process of 1 tablespoon water, 1 tablespoon whole wheat, 1 tablespoon all-purpose flours for 7 days, okay? Around day 7, this is how much starter you're going to have, okay? She would have done some rising and some falling. She's going to look very speckly from your whole wheat, okay? Now, day 7, you have to make a decision. You're going to make the decision whether or not you want to double the starter you have, which means now we're going to take this out and we're going to measure how much this is, okay? However much this is, we're going to then add that amount of just the all-purpose flour. Now, we're cutting out the wheat flour. The wheat flour is there to fortify in the beginning and to feed your yeast, okay? So we're not doing that anymore with the whole wheat flour. We're now only feeding with our all-purpose flour. If you know you want to get into this full-time, you're gonna double up on what your starter is. So I think this is about 2 cups. So at this point is now when we start working with feeding it entirely and discarding. If you only want to make a loaf occasionally, measure out half a cup, quarter cup, and you're going to give it a quarter cup of all-purpose flour, a quarter cup of water. We're doing small because we're not doing a whole bunch of loaves. So day 7 is when you determine how much you're going to keep so that you'll know how much you're going to feed. Yes, it is a feed every day when you're getting it started. Okay, it is a feed every day. So then you have to start, what are we doing with the discard, which is just overflow of your sourdough. I got some sourdough recipes for you. I put up some with the crackers. The subscribers got the sourdough bagels. I'm working on another sourdough donut recipe, so we'll give you some stuff to do with your discard, because it seems kind of wasteful to get rid of it, which is why we do smaller and smaller amounts. You can also rest your sourdough starting, meaning that if I'm not using it this week, you can slide it in the back of the refrigerator and keep it there for 4 to 6 months and still be able to revive it by a feeding. Okay, so we're not going to do too much where we can't maintain. All right, so if you have any other questions, I'll try to get into specific details if you're going to try this process. That's day 1 through 7. Okay, then you know how to feed it beyond that. My starter, we named her, of course. This is Tinky. She's named after my first granddaughter. I have found that it took me about, if I'm being completely honest, it took about 6 to 8 weeks before I was getting the rise and the lift from my sourdough starter that I was seeing everybody else do. And I know they say it could be done in a week and that type of thing. Honestly, for me and what I have gone through, it took about 6 weeks before she was putting in the air bubbles to really make it be like, okay, this is a quality thing. So like I said, any other questions, send them down there. We'll be covering this series for the next couple of weeks till we get through the holidays. So next week we'll come back because that's supposed to be your 7 days. I want to see how far you've gotten. We'll talk about it on live as well. So I hope this helps if you're starting your sourdough starter from scratch and you had any other questions. Also, The Perfect Loaf, if you're more into the science of sourdough, it's an amazing read for your sourdough baking. Okay, since we're on our library kick as well. Okay, so The Perfect Loaf, very scientific, but still a good read. So that's our sourdough for this Fermentation Friday. I hope to see you next week, and I'm gonna talk to you, neighbor.